When we threw religion and spirituality out of the public square, we created a spiritually non-conversant society. People stand way over in the corner and whisper if they're going to tell you something of a spiritual nature. We have disintegrated the core from the whole person, and that is a wobbly wheel.
Hi everyone, and welcome. My name is Rabbi Yosef Vogel.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lisa Miller. I'm a clinical psychologist and clinical scientist of 20 plus years at Columbia University in New York.
The word spiritual has powerful and deep connotations. Yet at the same time, it is also an ambiguous term. Let's begin by asking you to explain the term spiritual.
So as a clinical scientist, in fact, I would say scientists in general are not equipped to define spirituality, but we are very good at identifying threads of lived human spiritual life that are absolutely game-changing on the rest of our lives. And so too, we're also good at looking at the development, the etiology, the growth, if you will, of natural spirituality, how our birthright flourishes and how it can be truncated or even atrophy.
Would you say that human beings are innately spiritual? And if they're not feeling that, what would you advise for them to do to discover that?
So just as we have two eyes, a nose, and two ears, every single one of us is a naturally spiritual being. On day one, we are all born with a natural capacity for spiritual life. Now, that birthright may or may not be cultivated. By way of analogy, like a muscle, it may or may not be strengthened. But we all are given natural spiritual awareness, the deep felt love and connection, the sense that we are loved, held, and guided, never alone. This capacity to perceive the great presence of our higher power, whatever word that might be, Hashem, God, the universe. We're all built to be able to be in relationship with a higher power.
What would you say about spirituality and loneliness? Would you say there is a connection between being spiritually aware and feeling connected and therefore not lonely?
Our natural spirituality is actually a relational form of spirituality. We are built to know and feel that we are connected with Hashem, God, our higher power. And equally, many of the same neural correlates are associated with the ability to see the presence of God or Spirit, Hashem, in you. So relational spirituality contains both our capacity to have a heartfelt connection with God, as well as the ability to see God in one another.
Okay, so following that line of logic, how would this influence our ability to have healthy relationships with others?
When we awaken our natural spiritual capacity, we perceive that we are all emanations, like rays of the sun, from one source. That you are my brother, I am your sister, and so too fellow living beings are all emanations of one source. So let me put it this way. To my students at Columbia, I say we are a point and we are a wave. We are distinct and in different GPS coordinates and magnificently diverse. And we are like white caps on one ocean. We are part of one creation, one emanation of source. So both realities are true, that we're both separate and we're one. When we awaken our natural spirituality, it becomes clear that yes, you might be sitting in New York and I might be sitting in California, and you have your family and I have mine. But even in the moments of greatest isolation, when we're walled off in our COVID apartments, we are never alone. We are always connected to one another, and we are always connected to one another through God.
So what if someone is not feeling spiritually aware? They're feeling lonely and isolated. What would you recommend they do? How should they behave differently so that they can awaken that spiritual awareness?
In our darkest, most painful hour, it is actually the perfect time to awaken spiritually, whether we call it bottoming out or being overwhelmed with trauma. When the outward world as we know it falls apart, we are actually perfectly positioned to start to ask, what God, what Hashem, what do you ask of me now? Who can I grow to be? How can I love more deeply? What really is the nature of reality? These important portholes to a deeper walk in life are more accessible when we're in times of despair. So depression is not lost time. Despair is not a pothole in our lives. It is the ignition. It is really the trailhead of the spiritual path. Now, if I am feeling deeply depressed and I have nowhere to turn and I don't know how to start down the spiritual path, one of the surest ways to get going is to simply, feet first, walk out the door and do something for someone else. When we are kind to one another, when we engage in altruism, love of neighbor, we start to awaken our natural spirituality. When we love fellow human beings, it is very much part of the same love through which we are loved and love God. So this is a beginning, service, altruism.
So in other words, you're suggesting that the feeling of connection to others is triggered by action and behavior, by actually being kind to someone else.
A spiritual walk.
A spiritual walk. But that spiritual walk has to have practical application. There has to be action, you're saying, in terms of kindness to another person.
I think of it as prayer and action, that we're taking care of God when we take care of one another.
As a matter of fact, you know, the great sage, one of the greatest, Hillel, when asked to sum up religion standing on one foot, he doesn't even mention the word God. What he says is, what you don't like others to do to you, don't do unto others. Because to the degree that we're feeling connected with others, we consequently are more closely connected with God. So it's one and the same, it's two sides of the same coin.
So what Hillel knew, science now finally is able to hold up a mirror and show through MRI studies, which is that the same regions of the brain through which we perceive the presence of God are the same regions of the brain through which we perceive God in one another.
Now, can you use some more simple words to describe what you mean when you say to discover the presence of God? What do you mean when you say that?
Well, I can tell you from the view of clinical science that no matter what faith tradition we may be from, whether we are Jews or Hindus or Muslims or Christians or spiritual and not religious, we all use the same parts of the brain. It doesn't matter. This first of all, this makes religious war completely obsolete because there's one spiritual brain and we all have it. There's a universal capacity for spiritual awareness.
Now, when you say MRI tests to identify the spiritual part of the brain, what types of tests are they taking and during what experience?
So we invited 18 through 25-year-olds to come into the MRI and tell us two very different stories. Tell us about a time when you were very, very stressed, and tell us about a time where you felt a deep connection to God, the universe, Hashem, your higher power. Well, the first finding, which is perhaps the most important, was that never was a single person confused about that request. Everybody has a story of when in their deepest heart they felt a connection to their highest power. Everyone has had this experience. The second finding was that no matter whether I am Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, spiritual but not religious, when the story of connection to God is told, the same neural correlates run. It doesn't matter what my name for God may be. I'm using the same neural docking station of the human brain. There is one spiritual brain, and it's all of ours. We all have it. Now, whether or not we choose to engage our natural spirituality is, to a large extent, a matter of choice. This capacity is there for all of us. But just like, by way of analogy, a muscle, the more we use our spiritual brain, the stronger and more immediately present and capable this capacity for perception really is. Unfortunately, in much of post-industrial culture, the spiritual brain has been left to atrophy. That is probably the greatest cause of global suffering that I could possibly identify. The major cause of global suffering today is that post-industrial cultures have allowed the spiritual brain to atrophy.
You mentioned before two key words, and you use them as to mean not only different, but separate things. Spiritual on the one hand and religious on the other hand. Can you tell me the difference between those two terms?
So through the lens of science, we can use a twin study to see the extent to which any human capacity is innate or environmentally formed, or a combination thereof. So for instance, temperament, whether I'm outgoing or whether I'm introverted, whether I'm laid back or tightly wound, my temperament is half innate, half environmentally formed. The capacity through which we experience spiritual life, our natural spirituality, is 1/3 innate. It is in our genome. We can point to specific genes, we can point to circuits in the brain, we can show over the course of a lifetime how our world unfolds entirely differently if we are fully integrated with our natural spiritual core. Religion is 100% a gift of our ancestors, of our community. It is a rich opportunity to embrace the spiritual core and strengthen our spiritual awareness. Religion is not inborn. Religion is a gift of our community and our ancestors through which we can cultivate our natural spirituality, through which we are given a name for the higher power, a practice of transcendence to draw into connection with our higher power. It is a code of ethics derived from an understanding of ultimate reality. Religion is an extraordinary gift through which we can cultivate our natural spirituality. But religion in and of itself is entirely environmentally transmitted, whereas every single one of us has a natural spiritual core, the capacity to feel great love and connection, guidance, a sense of buoyancy through which we know we're never alone.
You talk about spirituality as if it can only be good. Is there a possibility for spirituality to be self-oriented and therefore at some point in the future can lead to something negative? Or is spirituality only good?
Spirituality in its core is our capacity to see, feel, and know that we're loved and held, we're guided, and we're never alone. Through the lens of science, using an MRI, we can identify a natural neural circuit in every single person's brain through which we have the deep clarity of being loved, held, guided, and never alone. This is the neural docking station, if you will, of the transcendent relationship, and it is purely good. Now, other parts of the brain, other parts of the person, for instance, egotism, self-servingness, can try to hijack in the name of spirituality, and call themselves spirituality. Other parts of the person, ego, narcissism, can, rip off the jersey and put on the jersey and say, no, I am spirituality, but they're not. They're ego, they're narcissism. Natural spirituality is our capacity to connect with God, and it is all good.
To summarize what you're saying is that spirituality, on the one hand, and egotism or any other form of self-centeredness, or let's call it selfishness, are mutually exclusive.
Yes, they are two different things.
Only sometimes, we try to manipulate and corrupt something even as pure as spirituality, but it's hijacked and therefore taken away from its source. That's what you're saying.
So I would say that there's the torch, the light of truth, the fire, And that might represent sacredness, spirit. And then there's the very oftentimes hardworking, sincere torchbearer who's only human. And whether I am a member of a congregation or a person given to good works, I could be a pretty good person, but still as a human being have foibled ideas about the light of truth. And then again, I could be a not very good human being and have profoundly foibled ideas about the light of truth. But no matter whether I'm good, moderate, or pretty bad, the light of truth still burns bright and is quite different than the torchbearer. I think a lot of young people suffer because they confuse the torchbearer with the light of truth. It's a point of tremendous confusion. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of people leave their faith tradition simply because they encountered a torchbearer who didn't walk the walk. But that was just one human being. That was just a naturally foibled human being. A direct relationship with the fire is what spirituality is about. And there are many good torchbearers who can help you hold the torch.
Do you think young people today have great challenges in connecting with themselves?
So unfortunately, I think we've given a lot of outward skills to the next generation. And to their great credit, for instance, Gen Z is exquisitely concerned with human rights. They're very careful about human rights. They are wonderfully sensitive in how they speak to one another. They're careful not to be a hater. They're careful to not make someone feel insulted. So there's so much kindness and goodness in Gen Z. They really are living spiritual values. But unfortunately, they have grown up in a culture and a climate that is nearly silent on spiritual life. 40 years ago, we threw religion and spirituality out of the public square, at the time in the good attempt to be inclusive. But it has had a tremendously painful effect on Gen Z. 40 years is long enough for someone to grow up, have a child who grows up and is a member of Gen Z. There are young people who have never read any sacred text of any tradition, who have never prayed or meditated by the side of a parent or grandparent, for whom moral life was not presented as derived from ultimate reality, but somehow cherry-picked or driven by pragmatics. So a public square silent on spiritual life has left young adults with very little of the rich two-thirds embrace, the necessary environmental cultivation of the natural spiritual core. When we threw religion and spirituality out of the public square, we created a spiritually non-conversant society. People stand way over in the corner and whisper if they're going to tell you something of a spiritual nature. We have disintegrated the core from the whole person, and that is a wobbly wheel. Perhaps one of the greatest losses of the past 40 years is that when we threw religion and spirituality out of the public square, we lost the voice of pluralism, where you speak with a whole heart of your Jewish experience and the next person speaks with a whole heart of their Hindu experience. I want to know you, and I want to know you deeply, which is to know your spiritual core. Well, relationships without a spiritual core don't contain the heart, don't contain the soul, don't hold the deepest part of the person. And we have become identified in very superficial ways, whether we're wearing a red or blue political jersey, whether or not we come from this GPS coordinate or that. Very, very simplistic. I would call it radical materialism, really only at the surface. We've lost the connection of being sisters and brothers, fellow souls on earth.
What would be your messaging to these young people in trying to reintroduce them to their innately spiritual selves?
I invite Gen Z, who are so sensitive and so smart and so capable, to explore opening their deep spiritual core. Practices of the heart, let love build and build and build. And when love is so full in your heart, you're ready to pass some on, throw it over to your so-called enemy. And practices of inner awareness. Connect with your true, deep, higher self. And once you feel very connected to your own eternal higher self, so much more than anything you have or don't have, done or not done, turn and look at someone in a different colored jersey and look at their higher self, right through their eyes, right past their clothes, to their deep soul. Gen Z is perfectly positioned to take the next step to be a spiritually aware generation. They've walked the walk outwardly, but the invitation now is to engage their deep inner spiritual heart. And then we will see an amelioration of the tremendous suffering, including the fear of the outside.
So on a slightly more philosophical level, we talk about the points and the waves, the particular and the universal. You're suggesting that the two of them can come together, which means to say, on the one hand, there is a universal truth. On the other hand, there's a particular truth. How do you reconcile those two ideas?
So I would say that God is the superposition of all living beings and all forms of expression, plus infinitely more.
Okay.
And that through the countervailing forces of diversity, there's actually a convergence onto the truth, the universal. That when we explore, when we question, when side by side we look into truth from different perspectives, we do better perhaps than when we go at it alone. If 400 people try to guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, the average of the 400 guesses will be more accurate than any single one of the 400. So I think it is the multiplicity of perspectives which converge onto a deep universal unit of truth.
That's fascinating. Would you say the same theory would apply to moral values?
Yes, unless there's been some terrible cultural human construction that sent everybody running down the wrong direction.
How do you think technology has influenced that sense of interconnection and interdependence?
40 years ago, if the telephone rang, we understood that the message came through a long wire that connected to another wire and went all the way around the earth, that we were mechanistically or materially connected. We now have a generation that has grown up on cell phones and understands the idiom that knowledge, truth, consciousness is pulled out of the air with the antenna of the cell phone. So for the first time, I think a consciousness-based reality, the notion that consciousness is primary and can manifest as material matter, but there's, with or without matter, a consciousness field. For the first time, we have a generation that perceives that consciousness, truth, information, love can be pulled out of the air, out of the consciousness field into our awareness, the antenna of the brain. The tropes, the idioms of the young adults are consciousness-based, and they view increasingly the brain as an antenna, not as a factory that makes thoughts.
You know, hence, it's all in the cloud. And as long as you're connected and sensitive to that cloud, you're able to draw knowledge, inspiration.
It's not a very big step to then say that clouds themselves have consciousness, that every bit of life is conscious and sacred.
Yet at the same time, there is the argument that as a result of social media, there's an opportunity for falsehoods or fakeness, anything that distorts that oneness of reality can have a more powerful negative effect on people. How would you respond to that?
So I think any technological leap can be used for the great flourishing of humanity or to our detriment. And if I think, for instance, let's go back 100 years to the automobile. Well, it's true that we could drive 20 miles over the speed limit and put others at risk and pollute the air and pave the beaches on both sides of the country, or we could use the automobile to reach people who are isolated, to feed people who are starving, to visit relatives who are sick. So how we use technology is up to the moral compass, really the inner spiritual compass of humanity. And we're certainly faced with that question now.
So ultimately, it's about the choices we make. Do you think, or where do you think it's all going to end? Are the odds in favor of a good ending to this story, or the opposite?
I think we have an extraordinary opportunity right now in this mass global despair to look more deeply into life and say, what is life showing me now? What source of all creation do you ask of us to love more, to see each other with a far deeper heart, to care for the earth? We have the opportunity of a lifetime for a spiritual awakening. So what is possible if we say yes? A global spiritual awakening, where we know each other as souls on earth, where we see into life's deeper reality, where we're more loving, more kind. We have the opportunity of a lifetime. But we have to say yes, and we have to do the work. We're hardwired to be able to deepen spiritually, to love more through suffering. Suffering is a knock at the door for an opening of the heart. It is an invitation for a deepening of spiritual life. We've had global suffering. This is our collective bang at the door to wake up spiritually and love each other a lot more.
So would you say that, on the one hand, young people are more spiritually sensitive and searching more deeply for that something that is missing in their lives today than, let's say, a generation or two ago?
So science shows us that late adolescence and emerging adulthood is a hardwired time of quest, where we search for what's true and we feel and care so very deeply about what's loving and just and right. And this has been true through the ages. It so happens that right now, those people coming of age during a time of global reorganization, during a time of global struggle, are exquisitely attuned to what comes in. And what's coming in is a very, very intense struggle between life and light, or disavowal and destruction. You can feel it. And young people are exquisitely poised to feel this 100-fold. That's why they're so-called flooded with mental illness. They're actually picking up on the energies around us.
So the quest is greater. Let's just say there is an existential vacuum which is looking to be filled. Yet it seems that there's no obvious guidance as to how to fill that, or which nutrition is needed for the spirit as opposed to the physical or mental or emotional. Again, what's your message to those people in terms of trying to convince them as to the type of nutrition they need for the quest they have today?
Well, old information is not going to solve this new problem. And when we use nothing more than our calculating, strategizing, tactical mind, we can only draw on today's information back throughout our lives and perhaps the lives of others. But to become a new society and to really flourish and reshuffle the way that we live our lives takes the type of inspiration and creation that comes not through ordinary calculating and recalculating, but instead comes through a different conversation with life. We need to stop asking, what do I want out of life? And start asking instead, what is life showing me now? What is life showing me now is an invitation for a dialogue with the deep spirit in and through life. What is life showing me now is saying, higher power, God, what am I to become so that I can live into this new world and adapt the next station in life you ask of us? So most of tactical strategic thinking can only avail itself of historical data. But the type of innovative, creative thought that we need now is a type of inspired thought that relies on an opening of our natural spiritual awareness. We need to awaken our natural spirituality and listen to what Spirit is showing and asking of us, and really guiding the way to a sustainable, beautiful world. We've got to do our part, which is show up and listen to Spirit.
It's fascinating to hear you say those ideas coming from one background, because what it does for me is remind me of very similar ideas from a mystical Hasidic background. And I'll give you the following framework. There's a beautiful psalm where King David talks about the eventual messianic day, which is revelation of the oneness of reality. And he uses the words, we will be like dreamers. And the question asked is, what's the dream? Is it the past or the future? And the commentaries explain it beautifully and say that initially we would think that the past is the reality and the future is the dream, when in fact, eventually, the reverse will be true. What we thought was reality is a dream, and what we thought was a dream turns out to be reality. In other words, we have to move away from the finite and move towards something which is more universal and timeless, where the future becomes the reference point and not the past. So I think, we both come from different vantage points to the same conclusion. And I think the way you put it is very beautifully put. I think again, and I go back to the point where me and you are having a good conversation, and I think there's a lot of alignment in our thinking. Somehow, and this is the struggle that we all have, somehow the young generation are very suspect, I think, of anything that sounds religious. And spirituality even sounds religious. So again, how do you gain their trust?
I think the proof is in the pudding, that awakening our natural spiritual brain augments our perception. We see far more deeply into life. We feel much more connection of the heart. Life unfolds in a much better way. And the problems that look so impossible to fix simply won't exist when we look through the lens of our awakened awareness.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe was focused on practical application, notwithstanding the deepest mystical insights. He always sought to apply those esoteric ideas into a practical behavioral lifestyle. In talking to people, young people, how should their day look? What would you advise them in order to awaken that spiritual sensitivity?
Before your 2 feet hit the ground, what a marvelous moment to recognize that you didn't die overnight, you're alive. And perhaps offer gratitude to the source of your life for today. And set your intention that you might fulfill the intention of the universe, whether that's to love, to care, to heal. And then once your day starts, make a particular effort to really love your enemy.
When they built the tunnel that connects Europe and the UK, they concluded that the most effective way to do that would be for the French to start digging from the French side underwater, and for the British to dig from their side, so that eventually at some point they meet together under the English Channel. You come from a scientific vantage point. I come from a mystical Hasidic vantage point. And I think and I believe that that meeting point and connection will be arrived at soon. Can you convey a message that neatly and beautifully brings those two worlds together.
We are one. We are made out of love. Whether it's through the Hasidic wisdom and writings or the lens of an MRI study showing our natural brain function, it's the same story. It's two lenses onto one truth.
And not only are they not contradictory, but they complement each other.
Beautifully put.
Thank you very much for your time and sharing all those beautiful insights.
Rabbi, a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you.